Hello and welcome to Film Threads, your brand new movie and TV podcast where we take a nostalgic, retrospective and light-hearted look back at the films and TV shows of yesteryear, all of which stitched together by a single theme. I'm your host, Trev, lifelong cinephile and proud possessor of more DVDs and pointless movie trivia than is socially acceptable. Film Threads is the audio magazine show that you didn't know you needed. Part review, part trip down memory lane, a quiz thrown in for good measure, and all wrapped up in a tone light enough to enjoy with your morning coffee or your evening wine. In each episode we take a different theme and explore film and TV through that lens. One week it might be something deep like films with hidden subtext. The next it could be rubbish films by great directors. One episode might explore films that traumatised us as kids, whilst the next might celebrate something as simple as movies with cats in them. You'll get retrospective reviews of films and TV that fit our theme. Then there's the Take 5 Trivia Quiz, our weekly quiz, just for fun, which shall each week be tied to the same theme. We'll also be taking a trip back in time to explore the UK box office top 10 from a mystery week in the past, in a segment which I'm calling the Top 10 Back When. Picking a date that threads neatly into this episode's theme is a chance to see what audiences were flocking to see back then and ask, was cinema really as great as we remember? Were we always drowning in sequels and remakes even back then? Or were the films of the time as original and bold as nostalgia suggests? Well, now that you know what the series is all about, let's dive into the very first episode. So, what's the first theme that we'll be exploring together? Well, picture a job where the stakes are high, the danger is real, and in this particular uniform it's not unusual to get a little hot under the collar. Yes, you've guessed it, this week we are talking about firefighters. Over the next hour or so, we'll be blazing our way through some of cinema's most flammable moments, exploring movies where the fire brigade steps into the spotlight. We'll be revisiting the big hitters, of course, films like Backdraft from 1991, Ron Howard's sweaty, explosive firefighting drama, the one that made fire look dangerous and Kurt Russell look heroic, especially with that hair. Then there's Ladder 49 from 2004, which dared to be more reflective, a little more grounded, a little more emotional. Starring Joaquin Phoenix and John Travolta, it's a film that took us inside the firehouse. It asked, what does it mean to run into danger when everyone else runs out? We'll also touch on Only the Brave from 2017, an underrated gem based on the tragic true story of the Granite Mountain Hotshots, a specialist team of wildfire firefighters. With Josh Brolin and Miles Teller, it's powerful, sincere and beautifully acted, reminding us that sometimes the biggest risks don't come with explosions and soundtracks, but with silence and sacrifice. We shall also take a look at a documentary film in which two filmmakers had set out to document the induction of a probational firefighter, but inadvertently captured a pivotal moment in history. And of course, if we are talking Hollywood firefighters, then we can't ignore the Towering Inferno from 1974. This week's I Should Have Seen It By Now, the granddaddy of disaster movies that brought us Steve McQueen as San Francisco's finest fire chief. We'll also be taking a quick look at some classic movies that aren't technically about firefighters, but where the brigade ends up playing a surprisingly key role, from absurd romantic comedies to gritty historical epics. These are the films you might not immediately link with flames and fire hoses, but you'll definitely recognise them all the same. But not everything this week is set in Hollywood, as first up we shall be jumping back across the pond for a quick nostalgic detour into the world of British TV. We're talking ITV's long-running London's Burning, a soap-style drama that lit up Sunday nights in the 1980s, 90s and early 2000s. We'll revisit the smouldering legacy of Blackwell's Bravest and ask whether it still holds up today. So whether you're here for the reviews, the quiz or just the nostalgia, it's time to grab your popcorn, put on your helmet and get ready to dive into the smoke and sparks of cinema's unsung heroes. This is Film Threads and things are about to heat up. London's Burning was one of ITV's longest running and most iconic dramas, lighting up front rooms on a Sunday night across the country in record numbers from 1988 all the way through to 2002. Set in the fictional Blackwall fire station, the series follows the lives of Blue Watch, a tight-knit crew of London firefighters navigating blazing infernos, personal struggles and the everyday challenges that come with a uniform. Over the years, audiences came to know and love the characters like the no-nonsense station officer Nick Georgiadis, the cheeky womaniser Billy Ray, dependable characters of Bayleaf, Recall, Sub-Officer John Hallam George. There was also plenty of comic relief in the form of characters such as a keen but green young recruit Colin, grounded posh boy Malcolm, the impulsive baritone Sick Note, and plenty of drama from characters such as the hot-headed but well-meaning Kevin and the unwelcome outsider Jeff Poison Pierce, and not forgetting the occasional rose amongst the thorns in the form of their female colleagues such as Josie Ingham, Kate Stevens, Sally Reid and Carol Webb. It mixed humour with tragedy, soap-styled relationships with high-stake rescues, and for many of us it was the first real insight into the world of firefighting. But before it became a staple of Sunday night TV, it all began with a single feature-length movie. Grittier, leaner and more realistic than the series that followed, the pilot was a raw depiction of fire brigade life in Thatcher's Britain, capturing the camaraderie, the pressures and the quiet courage that defined the job. It laid the foundations for everything that followed and more than holds up today as a compelling drama in its own right, with the firefighting being far more authentic than it ended up being in the later years, when even a toaster fire would end up with an explosion or 8. The London's Burning pilot, penned by the acclaimed screenwriter Jack Rosenthal, was originally conceived as a standalone feature-length drama that aired in December 1986. It introduced viewers to Blue Watch at Blackwall Fire Station, a tight-knit crew of firefighters whose daily lives were anything but predictable. From the opening scenes, it was clear that this wasn't about action for action's sake. It was a grounded look at the pressures and quiet heroism of these brave yet modest men and women. They weren't doing this for the praise or the thrills, but because it had to be done. Rosenthal based the idea on tales regaled to him by a friend of his in the service, as well as stories of firemen coming under attack during the Broadwater farm riot in London's Tottenham, a tragic event that also saw the brutal murder of a policeman. All of this spurred a concept in Rosenthal's head, and so he wrote the screenplay as a one-off movie. The story unfolds over the course of a few intense days, offering not just a snapshot of the job, but a glimpse into the heart of 1980s London itself. It's not all sirens and blazing infernos. The real drama lies in the balance between life on and off the watch, and the backdrop is a city still finding its feet in the latter half of a turbulent decade, with tensions between minorities and authorities simmering in the background throughout the film. But through it all, Blue Watch remains focused, always ready and always on call. What sets the London's Burning pilot apart is the way it presents the firefighting itself, not with cinematic bombast or adrenaline-pumping music, but with a quiet, almost documentary-like realism. These scenes are stripped of sensationalism. There's no score building tension in the background. Instead, we hear the wheeze of breathing apparatus, the crackle of the flames, the barked but muffled instructions from senior officers. It's immersive because it feels honest. The response then isn't superhuman heroics, but coordinated and precise teamwork and working to bring awareness to the public. Everything about these scenes of rescue speaks to structure and routine, the hallmarks of an operation built on protocol. From how they suit up in a matter of seconds to the way that the engines are packed, uncoiled and positioned at a scene, every movement feels trained and drilled. There's a clear chain of command, a military-like hierarchy where respect for rank is second only to the unspoken procedure and bond between the crewmates. And that's what gives the firefighting scene such real gravitas, the deep, hard-won trust between one another that makes those saves possible. As we see here, and we will again and again throughout the course of this episode, firefighters, unlike most jobs, are like a family unit, with a closer bond than the characters even share with their own wives and families. It's the recognisable characters that help to lend realism and relatability to the show which ultimately led to the film's success and therefore the commission for the series that followed. If you've ever worked in any male-dominated environment, you will instantly appreciate the archetypes and the playful way that they interact. At the heart of Blue Watch is Station Officer Tate, played by James Marcus, perhaps best known as one of Alex's droogs in Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange. Here he brings real weight and warmth to the role of Tate, both professional and paternal. His crew respect him, not just because of his rank and years of experience, because they know he's got their backs and he expects the same in return. At his side was Sub-Officer John Hallam, played by Sean Blowers. He's a henpecked husband at home, but at work he's the steady bridge between Tate and the rest of Blue Watch. He's just as comfortable sharing in the lad's antics as he is delivering orders, and he does both with a natural ease and the respect of the crew. John Hazeldine plays Mike Bayleaf Wilson, the dependable and approachable mess manager of Blue Watch. Bayleaf is something of a cornerstone within the crew, where both his opinion and his resolve are highly regarded. Then there's Malcolm, played by Rupert Baker, the so-called posh one of the group. With his public school education and clipped accent, he initially seems like a fish out of water among his blue-collar colleagues at the fire station. But in reality, the opposite is true. Malcolm is just as involved in the hijinks and practical jokes as anyone else. In fact, very often leading the charge. The comic core of Blue Watch comes in the forms of Vaseline, Sick Note and Charisma, three larger-than-life characters whose storylines in later episodes would veer into the downright absurd, but in this original pilot they're instantly recognisable as staples of any blue-collar workplace. Vaseline, the residence ladies' man, is played by comedian Mark Arden, best known as one half of the Oblivion Boys alongside Stephen Frost. In the early 80s, Arden and Frost were regulars in the emerging alternative comedy scene, popping up in cult shows like The Young Ones and Blackadder, and later becoming household names as the face of the hugely popular Carlin Black Label adverts. Vaseline himself is a classic example of the cheeky chancer, chauvinistic, casually racist, and constantly chasing women. His character's been married a handful of times, always bizarrely to women named Marion, and when we first meet him he's moonlighting as a gardener and carelessly flicks a cigarette into a compost heap. Naturally, that night Blue Watch is called out to that very same blaze, and Vaseline can be seen sheepishly hiding in the bushes, hoping no one recognises him. But Sick Note Quigley, played with brilliant comic timing by Richard Walsh, is exactly what his nickname suggests, the station's resident hypochondriac. One of the standout comic moments in the pilot comes when his GP, after an examination, delivers the line, "It's bad news, I'm afraid. I can't write you a sick note." Sick Note is heavily involved in amateur dramatics along with his long-suffering wife Jean, and has a natural knack for winding up the rest of the watch, whether it's by endlessly moaning about the imagined illnesses, pushing his personal lifestyle choices on everyone else, or simply just breaking into song. Leslie Charisma Appleby is played by Gerard Haran, a versatile character actor who would later become well known for his role as Terry Seymour, the proud and quietly passionate leader of the Danebury Metal Detecting Club in Mackenzie Crook's BAFTA-winning BBC comedy drama The Detectorists. As Charisma, he's Blue Watch's resident fantasist, a harmless but habitual embellisher, constantly spinning exaggerated tales of his exploits to anyone who will listen. His stories are rarely malicious, but they're always just a little too far-fetched to be believed, and his crewmates often humour him with a knowing eye roll. Also among the cast in this feature-length pilot is a young Jerome Flynn, standing out in one of his earliest roles as firefighter Kenny Rambo Baines. Though he wouldn't return for the full series, his presence adds a little spark to the pilot. Flynn, of course, would go on to find fame in Soldier Soldier and much later global recognition as Bronn the Sellsword in Game of Thrones. Although the pilot never loses sight of the camaraderie at the heart of Blue Watch, the banter, the bickering, the tomfoolery and the pranks, which really do make up some of the greatest scenes, beneath the laughs and the laddish ribbing, the show was quietly holding a mirror up to Britain in the mid-80s, and for all the warmth of the crew, it wasn't always a flattering reflection. Unlike the later years of London's Burning, which gradually lean into more soap-style storylines and a steady increase in the intensity and sensationalism of the action scenes, the original pilot film and indeed the early years of the series that followed struck a very different tone. It was, at its heart, a darkly comic yet sharply observant drama that used the fire station setting not just to explore moments of danger and teamwork, but as a lens through which to examine deeper social issues simmering under the surface. One of the most prominent storylines in the pilot revolves around Josie Ingham, played by Catherine Rogers, a new female firefighter joining a very male-dominated Blue Watch. At the time, the concept of a woman in that role was met with barely concealed hostility, laddish banter and outright sexism. While the pilot deserves credit for tackling this subject, it's fair to say that some of the surrounding attitudes and behaviours now feel a little more than outdated. Sexism was rife in these early episodes, presented largely without comment. But Josie's inclusion did offer a glimmer of change and brought welcome complexity to the group dynamic. The show made it clear that being a woman in this environment wasn't just about proving yourself physically, but surviving deeply ingrained cultural biases. But that being said, the same episodes were entwined with ridiculous moments of outdated sexual conduct, especially characters like Vaseline and George, whose approach to courting now looks uncomfortably creepy and inappropriate. Another aspect of London's Burning pilot that really sticks out today, and not in a comfortable way, is the nickname given to the station's single black firefighter, Ethnic. Now, in the context of the show, it's clearly intended as banter. The crew, for whom nicknames are important, are constantly ribbing each other. That's part of the glue that binds them. But observed from today's sensibility, there's an undeniable sting to this certain name. It's not just a nickname, it's a label which almost singles him out. It's a reminder, however casual, of how divisive language and humour once passed without comment. However, it does highlight something that the pilot does very well. It raises issues without resolving them. It puts them on the screen, lets us sit with the discomfort and trusts the audience to think about what it all means without preaching to us in one form or another, as today's media seems to do with an almost authoritarian leaning. In many ways, London's Burning was ahead of its time simply for acknowledging these tensions, even if it didn't have all the answers. But the main through thread of the pilot is the steady build up to the riots in the final act. The scenes that gave the series its title. The riot scenes in the London's Burning pilot are among the most striking and politically charged moments in British television of the 1980s. Set against the backdrop of a city simmering with frustration, these sequences feel less like scripted drama and more like a raw reflection of Thatcher-era Britain, an era marked by rising inequality, inner city tension and a growing disconnect between working class communities and the powers meant to serve them. The chaos unfolds not as random anarchy, but as the inevitable spark from a society left dry and angry by austerity, unemployment and years of perceived neglect. As bricks are thrown and sirens wail, we're reminded that London itself is a kind of pressure cooker, a tinderbox where one wrong move can ignite fury. A manifestation of everything that was coming apart at the seams: underfunded community, rise in unemployments, cultural alienation and the widening gulf between authority and the people on the ground. The blazes tearing through the estates and alleyways weren't just destroying buildings, they were symbolic of trust being burned away as well. In the midst of this, the fire brigade, typically seen as neutral protectors, find themselves caught in a moral and literal crossfire. Thrust into this epicentre of chaos, they are no longer simply lifesavers. In the eyes of the rioters, wearing a uniform now makes them a visual part of the system, and that system is seen as broken. The brigade becomes both target and saviour, public service and public scorn. It's a powerful twist that reframes the firefighter not just as a hero running into the flames, but as a frontline responder in a burning society. This pilot was a rare thing, a drama about bravery that didn't need to shout. It simply lit the match and let the realism burn. But what London's Burning has unintentionally become, both in this pilot and throughout the series, is a time capsule to the past. Not just a snapshot of shifting attitudes, but also a reflection of the steady improvements in both the show's production, as well as the changes and improvements within the fire service itself. From the equipment to the uniforms, it offers a unique window back into the 80s aesthetic, where every detail from the cars on the streets to the cornflake boxes in the background scream nostalgia. It gives us an authentic glimpse into a world that no longer exists and reminds us of how far both society and television has improved and yet has also been diluted ever since. OK, now it's time to leave the smoke-filled buildings of 1980s London and allow ourselves a bit of a breather. This is the section of the show where we take a step back from the film reviews, loosen the fire retardant collars and have a bit of fun with the Take 5 movie quiz. Each week I'll be throwing 5 movie questions your way, loosely inspired by the theme of the episode. Now today's thread, as you all know, is about firefighters. And whilst I could hit you with 5 questions about Backdraft, Ladder 49 and the Towering Inferno, I've decided to go for something a little simpler and dafter. So each film in today's quiz has just one thing in common. The word fire in the title. That's it. If it's got fire in the name, it's fair game. So if you're ready, clear your mental search engine, light a metaphorical match and let's play the Take 5 movie quiz. So this week's quiz is simple. I am going to give you a quick description, synopsis of a movie with fire in the title, and you've just got to name that movie. Easy, right? Question number 1. This 1985 film with a notable soundtrack and a cast including Emilio Estevez, Demi Moore and Andrew McCarthy follows a group of college friends as they try to navigate life after graduation. Question number 2. In this 2004 fast-paced thriller from director Tony Scott, a former CIA operative seeks revenge after the young girl he's protecting is kidnapped in Mexico City. Question number 3. This 1992 film by surrealistic director David Lynch is a prequel to a famous TV series and follows the troubled life of a high school student with a dark secret life. Question number 4. This 1984 movie features a neon-lit city and a tough ex-soldier rescuing his ex-girlfriend, a famous rock singer, from a gang, and features an early performance from none other than Willem Dafoe. And finally, question number 5. In this 1993 film, a man is abducted by aliens while working as a logger. So there you go, 5 scorching questions to get your brain smouldering. Whether you think you have all 5, guessed wildly, or now need to Google Willem Dafoe films with fire in the title, don't worry, I will be revealing the answers right at the end of the show. So stick around and find out whether you're hot stuff or just blowing smoke. Okay, so here we are, diving into another new segment, one that I'm calling I should have seen this by now. It's a bit of a guilty pleasure for me, finally catching up on those classic films that, for whatever reason, I've somehow managed to avoid over the years. You know the ones. They're considered iconic, and everyone has that look of disbelief when you admit that you've never actually seen that film. So the dubious honour of kicking off the I should have seen this by now segment, whilst continuing this week's firefighting theme, goes to a film that's been smouldering in my watch list for far too long. The kind of movie that builds its reputation not just on explosive set pieces, but on the sheer scale of its ambition. A towering example, quite literally, of 1970s Hollywood spectacle. And it's time I finally joined the party, even if the party's on the 135th floor and things are just starting to heat up. The film in question, of course, it's The Towering Inferno from 1974.
Steve McQueen and Paul Newman race against time as one tiny spark becomes a night of blazing suspense. The Towering Inferno.
It's out of control, and it's coming your way.
The Towering Inferno, the ultimate 1970s disaster movie, the absolute gold standard. A film so massive, so hot, that it took 2 rival studios, 2 best-selling books, and 2 Hollywood megastars to pull it off. It was released in 1974 at the peak of Hollywood's disaster movie craze, and it's a film that smoulders with tension, star power, and a healthy dose of over-the-top madness. Think of it as Titanic, but vertical. A monument to man's pride and technological ambition, soon to be humbled by nature, neglect, and some pretty questionable cost-cutting. The building is the Glass Tower, a shimmering San Francisco skyscraper meant to symbolise the modern brilliance. Instead, it quickly becomes a flaming death trap, thanks in part to dodgy electrics and a few very questionable budget decisions. Directed by John Gillerman and produced by Irwin, Master of Disaster, Allen, The Towering Inferno tells the story of the world's tallest skyscraper and the catastrophic blaze that erupts during its grand opening night gala. Before long, what starts as a minor glitch turns into a raging inferno, climbing floor by floor, and what unfolds is part thriller, part survival epic, and part exercise in Hollywood ego management. At the time, disaster films were big box office, and rival studios were racing to capitalise. Here is where it gets interesting. The Towering Inferno was actually the result of two competing projects from two rival studios. Warner Brothers held the rights to a novel called The Tower. 20th Century Fox owned the rights to another novel called The Glass Inferno. Both novels were written during a period when skyscraper construction was booming, particularly in the US. Following the completion of the World Trade Towers and the John Hancock Center, there was public awe mixed with anxiety about how safe these modern marvels truly were. So rather than duke it out in the motorplexes, squandering millions to pit against each other and possibly losing out because of it, Warner Brothers and Fox did something relatively unheard of. They teamed up, pooling their resources to co-produce a single mega movie. The result was the biggest budget film of its time and a landmark in disaster cinema. At the centre of it all, we've got architect Doug Roberts, Paul Newman and Fire Chief Mike O'Halloran, Steve McQueen, both trying to take charge in their own way. One designed the building, the other's trying to stop it from becoming a vertical crematorium. Naturally, they don't see eye to eye, especially once the finger-pointing starts. Paul Newman's Doug Roberts, the architect at the heart of the Towering Inferno, feels like he's been plucked straight from the same cloth as Thomas Andrews, the real-life designer of the Titanic, as portrayed as a tragic hero in various film adaptations. Like Andrews, Roberts is not a villain, but rather the idealistic creator whose vision has been compromised by others and who now bears witness to the consequences. He isn't responsible for the shortcuts. That honour goes to Richard Chamberlain's oily cost-cutter, but he's still morally bound to the outcome. This sense of ethical weight is key. He's not just trying to get out, he's trying to make it right. He's the conscience of the film, not the captain, not the financier, but the guy who knows the structure down to the last beam and mourns what's become of it. This archetype crops up again and again in 70s disaster cinema. Men of action and intelligence caught between bureaucracy, ego and the collapse of control. The idealist in a cynical world, a professional who dared to dream big but didn't have the final say. While Paul Newman represents the idealistic designer, Steve McQueen as Fire Chief Mike O'Halloran is the blue-collar pragmatist, the man on the ground who has no time for architecture, ribbon cuttings or billionaire egos. He doesn't want to hear about visions or budgets. He wants to know how many people are inside, where the fire started and how to contain it. McQueen plays O'Halloran with his trademark cool, but there's an underlying tension here, not just from the flames, but from the institutional disregard for expertise. He's the guy who deals with the fallout when corners are cut, and he doesn't mince words about it. When he finally does confront Newman's character, it's not with melodrama, but with exhausted rage. "You were lucky tonight," he says. "One of these days you're going to kill 10,000 in one of these fire traps, and I'm going to keep eating smoke and bringing our body until someone asks us how to build them." That line is a thunderclap, and it's classic McQueen playing characters who don't seek conflict but definitely won't back down from it, especially when lives are on the line. But beneath all the explosions and sweaty foreheads, the Towering Inferno actually raises a big old flashing neon question. Should we really be building these mega skyscrapers without thinking about what happens when something goes wrong? Steve McQueen's Fire Chief is not impressed by record-breaking architecture. In fact, he's downright annoyed that for all the technology, innovation and ego that went into scraping the skies with these fantastic buildings, no one bothered to ask a simple question: how do we fight a fire up there? He's a guy trained to tackle blazes in apartment blocks and warehouses, not navigate a vertical maze while flames rage hundreds of stories above the ground. And McQueen's character, ever the cool-headed realist, delivers that point with just the right mix of grit and exasperation.
Architects. Yeah, it's all our fault. Now, you know there's no sure way for us to fight a fire in anything over the 7th floor. But you guys just keep building them as high as you can.
Hey, are you here to take me on or the fire?
His rivalry with Newman's character mirrors the broader tension of the film. The dreamer versus the realist. Their dynamic crackles not with melodrama but with authentic, grudging respect. They're on the same side but not the same page, and that's what gives the Towering Inferno its human heat. It's well documented that McQueen and Newman had a friendly but intense rivalry on set, and it played out most subtly in the Towering Inferno. Both men wanted top billing, so the compromise was made with the addition of both names printed diagonally on the movie's poster. Classic Hollywood ego wrangling. Among the most hiss-worthy figures in the Towering Inferno is Richard Chamberlain as Roger Simmons, the building's cowardly and conniving electrical engineer. Though calling him an engineer feels overly generous. Simmons is the very embodiment of corner-cutting corporate greed, the man who knowingly authorised the use of substandard wiring to save money, effectively laying the fuse for the catastrophe to come. Chamberlain delivers the role with an icy arrogance and a smug self-assurance, always quick to deflect blame and quicker still to save his own skin, no matter who he has to portray or endanger along the way. What makes Simmons so detestable isn't theatrical villainy or cartoonish malice, it's how real he feels. He's not twirling a moustache, he's sitting in the boardroom with a spreadsheet, quietly compromising safety for profit. Then there's Jim Duncan, the corporate head of Duncan Enterprises, played with a mix of blustery authority and wary gravitas by William Holden. Holden gives the role an air of old-school command, a man used to getting things done, though not necessarily understanding how they're done. Unlike Simmons, Duncan isn't malicious or deceitful, he's simply out of touch, caught in the illusion that ambition and optimism are enough to hold up a 138-storey skyscraper. His pride in the glass tower is unmistakable, but it's tinged with a blindness to the very real shortcuts taken under his watch. Holden plays Duncan as a man slowly waking up to a nightmare of his own making. His scenes with Paul Newman are particularly telling. Roberts is furious, disillusioned. Duncan, defensive at first, soon becomes quietly ashamed. Duncan may not be responsible for the spark that ignited the fire, but he's left standing in its moral smoke. Supporting them is a rich roster of recognisable faces, each sketching out their own little survival tale amidst the chaos. Faye Dunaway as Susan Franklin brings poise and warmth to her role as Doug's partner, managing to do more than the standard damsel in distress bit, although she's somewhat underused. Jennifer Jones, in her final role, adds a gentle poignancy as a party guest who shared a touching arc with a young boy and tragically sacrifices herself during the glass elevator escape. Robert Vaughn pops in with his usual smooth authority, whilst Fred Astaire, surprisingly tender and charming, plays a lonely con man in Love, a role that earned him an Oscar nomination. There's also a small role by Felton Perry, one of the San Francisco firefighters, someone you've probably never heard of, but who'll look familiar if you've ever seen RoboCop 1 and 2, where he played the perennially out-of-his-depth OCP exec Johnson. A small role here, but a fun one for film spotters. Together, these supporting players help fill out a disaster world where class, status and moral fibre are all tested by fire. Each one of them has their moment in the spotlight, reminding us that while the stars carry the drama, it's often the side characters who carry the emotional punch. The film, as far-fetched and ridiculous as it can be, was also surprisingly grounded in reality. Fire safety experts were consulted, and McQueen reportedly worked closely with actual firefighters to make his performance authentic. You'll notice in the film the procedures, the chain of command, the gear, even the panic, and it all plays believably even with that Hollywood gloss. Where the film earns its stripes is where it leans into practical effects and genuine suspense. It's iconic because of the sheer scale and craft of the spectacle. The film stands tall as the gold standard of 1970s disaster cinema, and that's largely due to its thrilling set pieces, practical effects, and moments of nail-biting tension. Every blaze, explosion and crumbling floor had to be built, burnt and filmed for real. The production team created miniatures, massive interior sets and clever visual illusions that still hold up today. The exterior model of the glass tower is a masterpiece of visual trickery, and the scenes of fire crawling up the elevator shafts or bursting through walls often feel alarmingly real. The scene with the breeches boy, a single chair on a bouncing line evacuating guests across the fiery void, is pure sweaty palms brilliance. And the broken stairwell climb, tense, creaky, and convincingly terrifying. Also, let us take a moment to appreciate the deliciously retro 70s cinematography. There's something unmistakable about the cinematography of this era. The colours, the texture, the way the light dances across a practical set. It feels rich, tactile, a little bit gritty. And the Inferno leans into that with style. It's the same visual DNA you will find in films like Jaws, The French Connection, Taxi Driver. There's a grain to the image that feels both cinematic and grounded. It wasn't pristine, it wasn't digital, it was honest. When you see that look, you know you're watching something from a time when even blockbusters had grit under their nails. But let's not pretend it's all gritty realism. We start with an illicit office romance. Bigelow and his secretary who disable the phones for a bit of private time, only for the entire room to go up in flames a minute later. That escalated perhaps a little too quickly. The fire throughout the film acts kind of a mythical magic as opposed to a real fire, with many characters literally spontaneously combusting after barely coming into contact with the flames. And this only makes the scene in which Newman rescues the children feel more ridiculous than it actually is. He runs into this flaming room, scooping up the kids, sprinting through the fire with no gear whatsoever. Everyone else combusts on sight, but not Doug Roberts. He must sweat pure asbestos. The fire spreads like it's got a personal vendetta. And that helicopter crash, those poor girls on the roof panic the chopper so much that it crashes and explodes. I mean, come on. Then there's the scene with Steve McQueen and fellow firemen being lowered on top of an elevator. It looks a bit like a dance routine gone wrong, thanks to some ropey back projection and hand acting that deserves a Razzie. And the ending? Well, we blow up the water tanks for the big finale, triggering a slow-motion explosion that's straight out of the Jaws school of, how do we end this film with a bang? Despite, or maybe because of, the melodrama, the Towering Inferno remains a grand slice of disaster movie history. It's a towering achievement of spectacle, Hollywood cheese and raw star power. Is it realistic? Absolutely not. Is it fun? You bet your bottom dollar. It's an inferno of Hollywood excess. A flaming cocktail of earnest drama, bonkers decisions and genuinely impressive craft. Critically, it was a hit. 8 Oscar nominations, including Best Picture, and 3 wins for cinematography, editing, and the song We May Never Love Like This Again, performed during the ballroom scene by Maureen McGovern. And legacy-wise, The Towering Inferno remains the gold standard of disaster films, influencing everything from Die Hard to Backdraft, and even modern epics like The Day After Tomorrow. It's that rare mix of genuine tension, all-star chemistry and grand-scale filmmaking that just doesn't get made like this anymore.
This is a race against time to save hundreds of people trapped in a night of blazing suspense as the world's tallest building becomes the Towering Inferno.
Okay, so now let's get out of the heat for a minute, stand clear of the smoke, catch a breath of fresh air as we turn the clock back, take a look at the top 10 back when, December 1986, being the same month pilot episode of London's Burning first hit British screens. So let's dive into the top 10 films from December 1986 as taken from Box Office Mojo. At number 10 is Top Gun from Paramount Pictures, the ultimate high-flying 80s action film from the late Tony Scott, which became a massive cultural touchstone, catapulting the worldwide trend of the bomber jacket and the aviator glasses. Tom Cruise, in his breakout role as Maverick, sets heart racing with the soundtrack, the jet fighter stunts, and the unforgettable volleyball scene. Commercially, it was a juggernaut, grossing over $350 million worldwide. Top Gun became a symbol of 80s excess, but did it have staying power? Absolutely. Number 9 from Touchstone Pictures is The Colour of Money. The Colour of Money, directed by Martin Scorsese, saw Paul Newman reprise his iconic role as Fast Eddie Felsom from The Hustler, alongside Tom Cruise yet again, who was fast becoming a superstar himself. Scorsese's film blends a touch of sports drama with sharp dialogue and intense pool tables. Newman won an Oscar for his performance and it was a commercial hit. Critics lauded the film for its nuanced storytelling, though it's perhaps overshadowed by other Scorsese's classics. Do we still talk about The Colour of Money today? Not as much as Goodfellas, but it remains a fascinating path of both Newman's and Cruise's career. Number 8, Little Shop of Horrors from Warner Brothers, an absolute gem of a musical. Directed by Frank Oz, this darkly comedic cinematic version of the off-Broadway show, which itself was a remake of the 1960s Roger Corman B-movie, starred Rick Moranis alongside the likes of Steve Martin, Bill Murray and John Candy, and a really impressive animatronic man-eating plant, courtesy of Jim Henson's Creature Shop. Mixing horror, humour and an unforgettable score, Little Shop became a cult classic. Commercially successful, it's still adored by musical fans everywhere, with a stage revival in the 2000s and plenty of discussions on the tragic alternate ending. Number 7 is Lady and the Tramp, a re-release by Disney. The beloved animated Disney classic, originally from 1955, made its return to cinemas in 1986. With its iconic spaghetti scene still referenced today. Though the re-release didn't make as much of an impact as some of the other films on this list, it marks Disney's continual push to refresh its back catalogue. Number 6, An American Tale from Universal Studios. It's a sweet animated movie directed by Don Bluth, which tells the story of Fievel Mousefitz, a little mouse who emigrates to America in search of a better life. It's a family-friendly film full of charm, memorable songs and a heartwarming journey. Number 5, The Three Amigos. This comedy classic, directed by John Landis, starred Steve Martin, Chevy Chase and Martin Short, is a film that played on the cowboy movie genre, with the three stars portraying clueless actors mistaken for real heroes. It's a film that gained cult status, even if it wasn't the biggest hit when first released. Today, it's a beloved classic, and the trio's chemistry is still a high point for fans of 80s comedies. In fact, this is the film that gave us the pairing of Martin and Short, which is still going strong today. Number 4, Crocodile Dundee from Paramount. Crocodile Dundee is a film that truly made Paul Hogan a household name. Directed by Peter Fairman, this Australian comedy combines laughs with adventure and introduced Aussie comedian Hogan as the rugged Mick Dundee. This one became a phenomenon in the US, grossing over 300 million worldwide. Crocodile Dundee spawned sequels, but none captured the magic of the original. Still one of the quintessential fish out of water stories from the 80s. Number 3 is Heartbreak Ridge from Warner Brothers. Clint Eastwood's Heartbreak Ridge is a war film about a grizzled Marine who's tasked with shaping up a group of misfit soldiers. It's a no-nonsense, tough-as-nails portrayal of military life, and Eastwood's direction and performance made it an instant hit. Although it wasn't universally loved by critics, its box office success was testament to Eastwood's star power. It's a film that doesn't get much attention today, but for fans of Eastwood's work, it remains a standout in his career. Number 2, The Golden Child from Paramount Pictures. The Golden Child is an odd blend of fantasy, comedy and action starring Eddie Murphy and directed by Michael Ritchie. The film follows Murphy's character, a social worker tasked with finding a magical child in the Himalayas. Despite mixed reviews, The Golden Child was a commercial success thanks to Murphy's charm and the quirky premise. Though it didn't spawn sequels, it's one of those films that still brings a smile to those who remembers its 80s vibe. And number 1, another Paramount Pictures film, Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home. Directed by Leonard Nimoy, this is the Star Trek film where the crew travels back to save 2 humpback whales into the future. A bit of a departure from the usual sci-fi fare, The Voyage Home is considered one of the most beloved entries in the Star Trek franchise. It's the film that proved the series could still be fun without sacrificing the heart of the characters. It also grossed over 100 million worldwide, making it the highest grossing Star Trek film at the time. So there you have the top 10 back when. It's impossible to discuss the artificial spectacle of the Towering Inferno, as mentioned, a film inspired by the construction of the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, without acknowledging the real-life tragedy that came decades later on September the 11th, 2001, a day that saw 2,996 people lose their lives when a coordinated Al-Qaeda attack took place on the heart of America. 343 of those who lost their lives were firefighters. These men, marching steadily up the towers as the rest of the buildings were being evacuated, had their lives extinguished. The firefighters played a massive part in the rescue operations of that terrible day, the day the world changed forever. In so many ways, they symbolised the city's unity, that sense of coming together in the face of adversity. And there is no more powerful or important film about that tragedy than 9/11. The 2002 documentary by brothers Jules and Gideon Naudet, a deeply personal and profoundly human account of one of the darkest days in modern history from those at the front lines. It began as a humble project to document the early days of a New York probationary firefighter known as a probie, but it turned into the only eyewitness account filmed from within the World Trade Center during those attacks. The brothers had been embedded with Engine 7, Ladder 1, Battalion 1, a firehouse on Duane Street in Lower Manhattan, with the aim of capturing the journey of Tony Benedictus, a young, wide-eyed rookie starting his firefighting career. To begin with, Tony is earning his stripes, and we see him at odds to the Brotherhood. These are men who work together, eat together, joke, argue, laugh, and live together. There's a deep, unspoken bond, and they all know the routines. At this point, however, Tony doesn't. At first, the story seemed almost mundane. Tony was what they call a white cloud, a kind of a new guy whose shifts never seemed to bring in a real fire. His early tasks involved cooking, cleaning and waiting. The filmmakers jokingly began to wonder if they were making a cooking show rather than a documentary about firefighting. And what's important to remember is that when watching these scenes, the long quiet shifts, they took place in a different world to the world in which we watch now. These firemen, at the beginning, are living in the pre-9/11 world, despite the talking heads narration filmed since the events. These firefighters on screen, and also the two French filmmakers themselves, had absolutely no comprehension of the horror that was just around the corner. How could they? And then, just days before September 11th, they attend Tony's first firefighter funeral, a 27-year-old rookie laid to rest with solemn ritual and aching reverence. Firefighters lined the streets, heads bowed in their pristine uniforms. The sheer number of uniforms is overwhelming. And Tony, reflective and shaken, says, "I hope I don't get to see another firefighter's funeral again." None of them knew what was coming. On the morning of September 11th, Jules rides along with Battalion Chief Joseph Pfeiffer on what seems like another routine call, investigation of a suspected gas leak. The filmmaker's camera is rolling when American Airlines Flight 11 roars overhead and crashes into the North Tower. In that moment, Jules captures one of only 3 known recordings of the first plane hitting the building. It's raw, accidental, and utterly haunting. Meanwhile, back at the firehouse, Gideon stays with Tony, who is left behind as the rest of the unit is scrambled to the tower. As events escalate, Tony becomes the only firefighter in the building, manning the phones and watching the chaos unfold on TV, not yet knowing how close his crewmates are to danger. And what follows is a film unlike any other. Part first-hand account, part historical record, but always deeply human. Jules follows Pfeiffer into the tower's lobby, where a command post is hastily established. The glass is blown out, dust and debris coat every surface, and the sounds overhead are relentless. At first, the crashing is thought to be debris falling onto the lobby entrance roof, but it soon becomes horrifically clear that these are people choosing to jump from those upper floors rather than face the inferno. The realisation hangs like a shadow over every frame. When United Airlines Flight 175 crashes into the South Tower, Gideon, now on the streets near Ground Zero, captures the explosion and the stunned reaction of bystanders. The moment shifts everything. The public confusion turns to fear. Panic spreads and the air thickens with ash and terror as it becomes clear that the first plane was probably not an accident after all, but something far more sinister. Inside the North Tower's lobby, Jules is still filming as the building begins to collapse. The sound is unbearable, the roar of 1,000 freight trains tearing through concrete. The mic on Jules' camera cannot handle it and distorts and cracks up. And as Jules and the firefighters around him charge the staircases, the camera is pitched into darkness. The world turned to dust and silence. Miraculously, Jules and many others survive and escape, but not all make it out. Among the fallen is the firehouse chaplain, filmed moments earlier comforting others. In later years, the Naudet brothers returned to revisit those that they had filmed, documenting how their lives had changed and how many faced lasting health issues from exposure to the burning toxic emissions. The follow-up, 9/11, 10 years later, reflected not just on the horror, but on the resilience of those who served and on the rebuilding of One World Trade Center, a new tower rising from the ashes of the old. This documentary is a story of brothers, and both the filmmaker's siblings separated on that day, each fearing the other lost, and the brotherhood of the firehouse, men who live and work together, trust each other with their lives, and run towards danger when others flee. Again and again, this is what we see in these iterations of a firefighter's life, the bond between fellow firemen, a real family away from home. In fact, as stated in this documentary, as in London's Burning and other films that we'll be looking through, these men cannot wait to get to work. It's their sole reason for living. I remember 9/11, that feeling that something irreversible had happened, that the world had changed. Although I'm not an American, it felt like an attack on all of us, our culture, our shared sense of security. It highlighted the clash of ideologies that still resonate today. The Twin Towers had been part of our cinematic landscape, making appearances in the background of films such as Superman, Men in Black, even the trailer for the new Spider-Man film at the time, where Spidey spun a web between the towers to catch a fleeing helicopter. They were part of the New York landscape, and in a single morning they were gone, and with them, so had the feeling of security. And this film brings that memory into sharp, intimate focus. We watch the moment when the world changed forever. If you watch one documentary about 9/11, let it be this one. And while we're on the subject of firemen being documented not as professionals but as symbols of resilience, duty and quiet heroism, it's worth rewinding the clock and crossing the Atlantic to another moment in history when fire crews found themselves at the very heart of a national crisis. Enter Humphrey Jennings. Now, Jennings isn't a household name these days, but in the 1940s, he was one of Britain's most poetic and quietly powerful filmmakers, a documentarian with a painter's eye and a poet's heart. He was part of the Crown Film Unit during the Second World War, tasked with creating morale-boosting films that captured everyday heroism on the home front. And perhaps his most striking work is Fires Were Started, from 1943, a film that blends real footage with dramatic reconstruction to tell the story of a single day and night in the life of a London fire crew during the Blitz. It's understated but powerful. It shows us the camaraderie, the waiting, the quiet dread, and then the chaos when the bombs fall and the fires rage across rooftops. What Jennings captured wasn't just the physical act of firefighting, but the soul of a country trying to hold itself together in the face of an unimaginable pressure. In a way, it shares a thread with that raw first response documentary that came out of 9/11, unflinching, respectful and deeply moving. And it's fascinating to see even how across decades and vastly different wars, the figure of the firefighter remains a powerful cinematic symbol of protection, resilience and community. Fires Were Started is a brilliant example of how character and community are portrayed not through sweeping drama or grandstanding speeches, but through the everyday rhythms of working people doing extraordinary things. The film follows a newly transferred fireman named Barrett, a stand-in for any number of real recruits at the time, as he joins a London Auxiliary Fire Service unit. There's very little in the way of conventional character development, but that's part of the film's charm and power. These aren't characters in the Hollywood sense. They're composites of real men doing real work, played by actual firemen rather than actors. They're defined by action, quiet humour, camaraderie and resilience. You've got the station officer, a calm, experienced presence who commands with understated authority. He's a figure of steadiness, the kind of leader that you'd want in a crisis. There's the gruff, chain-smoking veteran who jokes about tea and biscuit but springs into action the moment that the bells go. And then there's the younger lads, all banter and bravado until the firestorm begins and they're suddenly climbing burning buildings with hoses and determination in their eyes. Each has a role, pump operators, hose handlers, laddermen, lookouts, all cogs in a perfectly timed machine, and Jennings shows us the necessity of each position without ever stopping to explain it. Then there are the women, often overlooked, but their roles are absolutely vital. They're not on the fire engines, but they're just as essential to the operation. Some are seen manning the control rooms, coordinating responses, logging details of call-outs and maintaining communication during bombing raids. Others are shown doing dispatch work, helping with equipment preparation or in supporting roles around the station. Watching this straight after 9/11, there's something almost haunting, but also deeply moving about stepping back in time. The distance between these two events, September the 11th and the Blitz, is vast. Different continents, different enemies, different technologies, different media landscapes. But at the heart of both lies the same constant, the fire brigade. The same quiet, relentless bravery, the same rush towards danger while others flee, the same camaraderie, gallows humour and emotional toll that comes with the job. In Fires Were Started, you don't see men in high-tech gear or descending on hydraulic lifts. There's no computer-aided dispatch or digital comms. The equipment is rudimentary, the methods basic, but the instincts, the courage, the rhythm of life in the firehouse, that's unchanged. You watch these men roll cigarettes around the kitchen table, wait out the quiet hours awaiting those ominous air raid sirens, and it feels eerily similar to the Naudet brothers' depiction of those New York firemen sitting about, unaware that the events of 9/11 are just around the corner. And in both, you get that odd juxtaposition of mundane routine and sudden chaos. In Jennings' film, they're sweeping floors, talking about the weather, having a good old-fashioned sing-song and a game of pool, and then suddenly they're on the roof in the middle of the night, silhouetted against a wall of fire. What Jennings does and what makes Fires Were Started so remarkable is not just show the danger, but also the rhythm of the life around it. So whether it's 1940s London during an air raid or Lower Manhattan in 2001, fire brigades are made up of people who show up quietly every day to do a job most of us would never dream of. The gear may change, the threats may evolve, but that spirit, that willingness to run in, never does. Okay, so this segment is what we call I Forgot They Were Firemen. As we've established, there are the obvious films where firefighting is front and centre. It's all about the flames, the danger, the mission. But every now and then there are those films where you probably forget firemen were even involved. You know, the ones where the main character just happens to be a firefighter but could just as easily have been a dentist or a bus driver. In this segment we're looking at exactly those kinds of films and asking, why a fireman? Was there any deeper meaning, or was it just a convenient character choice? The first film to pop into my mind when thinking of firemen where the plot doesn't request it is Steve Martin's 1980s rom-com Roxanne. Steve Martin's C.D. Bales might be best remembered for his glorious Shakespearean nose and quick-fire wit, but let's not forget, the man's a fire chief of a sleepy, small-town fire brigade. Now, to be fair, his team of firemen feel more like extras from Police Academy than frontline heroes, clumsy, lovable, and about as useful in a blaze as a damp sponge. But then they haven't had the practice. But they're there, and the film makes a gentle joke out of it. The genius of Roxanne is how it uses firefighting as, not just as a job title, but as a counterbalance to CD's emotional life. He's this brave, capable guy who puts himself in physical danger without blinking. Yet when it comes to love, he's all tangled up in nerves and self-doubt. So yeah, firefighting becomes a metaphor of sorts. Frequency is a film that kind of sneaks up on you emotionally. Dennis Quaid plays a firefighter in the late 1960s who dies in a warehouse blaze, only to reconnect across time via a ham radio with his grown-up son. It's part mystery, part thriller, part science fiction tearjerker. But again, being a fireman isn't accidental here, it's central to everything. It's the reason he dies, it's the reason his son becomes obsessed with changing the past, and ultimately it's what gives his character this innate heroism. There's something universally understood about the image of a fireman, selfless, dependable, brave. The image becomes the emotional backbone of the story. You want this guy to live, not just because he's someone's dad, but because he's one of the good ones, a lifesaver. And when the son starts solving cold cases and tracking serial killers thanks to this temporal walkie-talkie setup, the fireman origin almost gives the whole thing a spiritual, cosmic symmetry, saving lives across time, one emergency at a time. Now let's pivot completely with Collateral Damage. Arnold Schwarzenegger, muscles, vengeance, explosions, and firefighter. Yep, he plays Los Angeles firefighter whose family is killed in a terrorist attack, and he subsequently goes rogue and starts chasing international terrorists like he's Jason Bourne with a fire axe. Let's be honest, the fireman aspect here is mostly window dressing. It's shorthand for regular guy, even though Arnie has never looked like a regular anything in his entire life, and still his profession gives the film enough emotional grounding. He's not an elite soldier, he's not CIA, he's not even a cop. He's a first responder, someone trained to save lives, not take them. So when he goes full vigilante, we feel that tension. The film plays off of that contrast. Here's a guy whose job is literally to put out flames, and now setting the world on fire for justice. It's not subtle, but I guess it's effective. But we can't forget Gangs of New York, not your usual fireman film, granted. But in the middle of all this chaos and top hats and brutal street violence, there are these oddly fascinating gang-run fire brigades. That's right, back in the 1800s, firefighting was less noble service and more turf war. Whoever got to the fire first got to save and loot the property. It's like Backdraft meets Peaky Blinders. The firefighting here is dirty, political and chaotic, and it's fascinating to see it portrayed as something so deeply corrupt and self-serving, because it reminds us that the nobility we associate with firemen today was something that had to evolve. It wasn't always helmets and honour. Sometimes it was brass knuckles and opportunism. And finally, Ghostbusters. Okay, fine. Technically, they're not firemen, but come on, they live in a firehouse. They slide down a pole, they wear uniforms, drive an emergency vehicle, and respond to calls from the public to deal with crisis. Just swap ghosts for grease fires, and it's basically the same gig. There's something deliberately nostalgic about the firehouse setting, too. It grounds their outlandish sci-fi adventures in something familiar and respectable. You believe in them as a team because the setup evokes real-world camaraderie and service. It's probably no coincidence that they look like they could join a ladder company if the whole proton pack thing didn't work out. It lends them credibility even while they're zapping ghouls and cracking wise. So what have we learned here? That firefighting is one of those professions that filmmakers can pull in a dash of heroism, a pinch of metaphor, or just a strong visual. Sometimes it's emotional weight, like in Frequency. Sometimes it's ironic contrast, like in Roxanne. Sometimes it's action credentials, like in Collateral Damage, or even historical commentary, like Gangs of New York. And sometimes it's just a really cool place to keep your ghost traps. So yeah, you forgot they were firemen, but now that you remember, doesn't it kind of make these films even more interesting? Okay. It's time for the final chapter in our very first episode of Film Threads, and we are closing things out with a blaze of cinematic glory. We're putting 3 firefighter dramas through their paces in a no-holds-barred movie face-off. Each one brings something different to the table, from intense action to emotional weight, but only one can walk away with the crown. 3 films, 3 takes on life in the fire service, but which one burns brightest? Let's dig in and find out. The first of our 3 firefighter movies to be reviewed is Only the Brave from 2017. It's a biographical drama directed by Joseph Kosinski, the same guy that brought us Tron Legacy and more recently Top Gun Maverick. But here he pulls the throttle right back, taking us into very different territory. A grounded, character-driven tribute to a very real team of American heroes, the Granite Mountain Hotshots. The film tells the story of an elite crew of wildfire firefighters from Prescott, Arizona, who fought the devastating Yarnell Hill fire in 2013, a tragic event that saw the most firefighters killed since those fateful days of 9/11. It's a heavy film, and knowing the outcome before going in doesn't seem to soften the blow. If anything, it adds a kind of a slow, simmering heartbreak to the experience. But what makes Only the Brave so compelling is how it doesn't just treat these men as heroes, it treats them as humans. We start at home with Josh Brolin's Eric Marsh, gravel-voiced, intense, driven, and his wife Amanda, played by Jennifer Connelly, who brings some real emotional weight. Their relationship has this raw, lived-in feel. You see the love, the wear and tear, and the resentment building, especially around Marsh's single-minded devotion to his job. It grounds the film right away. Brolin is solid here, doing what he does best, stoic, masculine leadership with just enough vulnerability underneath. Jeff Bridges, too, as Dwayne Steinbrink, is almost doing a Southern Fried version of Crazy Heart meets Bubbles from Trailer Park Boys. A little larger than life, but there's warmth and depth there too. That said, we have seen both of these guys in similar roles before. Where the film adds freshness is with Miles Teller as Brandon Donut McDonough, a recovering junkie trying to turn his life around. His arc is honestly the emotional heartbeat of the film. He starts as this lost, wiry kid, recently arrested, thrown out by his mum and unwelcomed by his ex, and he claws his way into the team through grit and humility. You see him earn the respect of the others. There's a classic misfit joins the crew vibe, but it's done with sincerity and some great chemistry, especially with a fellow firefighter he butts heads with early on. Visually, Only the Brave is stunning. Kosinski's background in visual effects is clear, but he uses it tastefully. The aerial photography, the vast mountain landscapes, the rolling plumes of smoke like slow-motion avalanches. They're not just pretty, they're powerful. They remind you just how small people are in the face of nature and how terrifyingly fast fire can move. And this is a different kind of firefighting. It's not your typical city fire engine race into a house blaze. These guys fight fire with fire, literally. They do controlled burns, cut fire lines and hike miles through rugged terrain with 60-pound packs. It's as much about endurance and calculated risk as it is bravery. The film doesn't always dive deep into the technical side, but it gives you just enough of the process to appreciate how physically and mentally demanding and punishing this work really is. There's military-style training to become certified as hotshots, the elite of the elite, and these sequences give a nice gritty contrast to the more emotional beats. The fire scenes themselves are pure cinema, not always documentary realistic, but they're immersive, urgent, and often beautiful in a terrifying way. Now, structurally, you could argue Only the Brave follows a familiar blueprint. It echoes The Perfect Storm, Deepwater Horizon, even Everest. But just because the template is familiar doesn't mean the execution isn't effective. You care about these characters. The film earns your emotion, especially in the third act. Of course, some elements are dramatised. McDonough wasn't bitten by a rattlesnake, for instance, and the way families learn about the deaths was more private and fragmented in real life rather than the gymnasium scene we see here. But overall, the film is respectful. It ends with a tribute showing the real fallen firefighters alongside their on-screen counterparts, and it's genuinely moving. You feel the weight of that loss. And finally, there's that sense of brotherhood. Like so many great firefighter or military stories, this film highlights how these crews become families. They work, fight, laugh and grieve together. It's not just a job, it's a calling. And Only the Brave honours that spirit in a powerful way. Ladder 49 from 2004 follows the story of Baltimore firefighter Jack Morrison, portrayed by Joaquin Phoenix, as he reflects on his life and career whilst trapped inside a burning warehouse. As his fellow firefighters, led by Chief Mike Kennedy, John Travolta, race to rescue him, Jack's memories unfold in a series of flashbacks from his early days as a rookie to becoming a seasoned firefighter and family man. These moments highlight the intense camaraderie of the firehouse, the emotional and physical toll of the job, and the deep personal sacrifices made in service to others. The film juxtaposes the thrilling and dangerous nature of firefighting with Jack's personal journey, including his marriage, fatherhood and close bonds with his firefighting brothers. As the rescue operation intensifies, Jack comes to terms with the choices he's made and the legacy he'll leave behind. Ultimately, Ladder 49 is a tribute to the bravery, duty and humanity of firefighters, blending action, emotion and reverence for real-life heroism. Unfortunately, it often comes off as dull and lacking in any real substance. Directed by Jay Russell, Ladder 49 opens strongly with striking visuals as the fire engulfs the warehouse and Jack and his Ladder 49 search and rescue team arrive on the scene. However, Lewis Collick's screenplay leads towards the melodramatic and feels somewhat formulaic despite its non-linear structure. The film begins with Jack trapped in the burning building, then shifts between the present-day rescue effort and flashbacks from his career and personal life. While this irregular narrative approach aims to add emotional depth, it doesn't quite achieve the intended impact. Knowing Jack's fate from the outside diminishes the tension and urgency of the movie's additional firefights and rescue missions that make up his origin story. In fact, the film's opening, which sets the stage for the entire narrative, feels implausible. Jack's survival after such a brutal multi-story fall especially when surrounded by collapsing steel and concrete, already stretches credibility, but the fact that he's still conscious and mobile afterwards borders on the absurd. Realistically, falls from far lesser heights have left people at best paralysed or, worse still, dead on sight. And this makes the film's emotional core feel a little bit too fantastic. In flashback, we're introduced to Jack as a rookie firefighter during his probationary period. His initiation into the firehouse culture includes a series of light-hearted hazing rituals, most notably Station Captain Mike Kennedy, played by Travolta, pretending to be a drunken mess in his underwear, and a mock confession scene in which the gruff firefighter Lenny, Robert Patrick, poses as a priest to extract a confession from the unsuspecting new recruit. As the story unfolds, Jack develops into a skilled and dependable firefighter, starting out on Engine 33 as a hosman, and then the film charts his personal life from meeting his future wife, through their courtship, marriage and eventual family life, whilst also touching on his bond with the rest of the crew and their unflinching courage. However, despite the emphasis on camaraderie, Jack's fellow firefighters are largely underdeveloped. Aside from a few brief moments, most of them feel like generic background characters, lacking the depth or individuality needed to make their relationships with Jack truly resonate. And as a consequence, it's really hard to care at all. Tragedy soon strikes when Jack's close friend Dennis, a member of the Ladder 49 Search and Rescue Unit, dies in the line of duty after falling through a collapsing roof. Strangely, it's immediately after Dennis's funeral that Jack decides to break the news to his pregnant wife that he plans to join the very same high-risk team that has just claimed his friend's life. And unsurprisingly, she is less than thrilled with the idea. And the timing of this decision feels a bit forced and hard to swallow from a character perspective. And this, obviously, causes the first rift in an otherwise perfect relationship. The performances here are nothing to write home about. Travolta and Patrick mostly swagger through their roles, with Patrick once again playing the familiar, gruff, tough blue-collar worker that we've seen him play many times before. The standout performances, if any, come from Joaquin Phoenix, who brings depth to an otherwise thinly written role, and Jacinda Barrett as his young wife Linda, who brings a quiet strength to her limited screen time. Despite a few well-executed moments, much of Ladder 49's firefighting action feels overblown, sacrificing realism for spectacle. The film frequently leans on big explosions and dramatic music cues, which ultimately undercut the grounded tone it seemed to be striving for. A standout example is the scene where Jack charges alone into a burning building to rescue a young girl, only for the apartment to erupt in a massive sky-piercing explosion with no real explanation. Yet somehow both Jack and the child escape the building practically unharmed, despite being engulfed in this massive fireball, which once again strains believability. While the film clearly aims to honour the bravery and sacrifice of firefighters, ordinary people facing extraordinary danger, it too often slips into formulaic, predictable storytelling. Emotional beats are heavily telegraphed. The inevitable death of Jack's best friend, the obligatory strain on his relationship, and the moment he receives the exact medal he was shown admiring earlier. These story turns feel less like organic development and more like boxes being ticked. The film's family and romantic scenes teeter on the edge of melodrama, not helped by a syrupy soundtrack packed with soft country ballads and sweeping Celtic-inspired music that evokes Titanic-era Celine Dion. The result is an overly glossy, sentimental Hollywood package that feels emotionally manufactured. By contrast, the gritty realism of London's Burning and the powerful authenticity of Only the Brave convey far more emotional weight and respect for the profession without relying on cliches. Now, the final film we'll be discussing in our free film face-off is probably the most famous of all the firefighting films we're discussing here, and it's Backdraft, Ron Howard's 1991 firefighting epic. That's about as subtle as an axe through a window. This film is loud, dramatic, ridiculous, occasionally moving, but very much a product of its time. It's a fascinating blend of family drama, murder mystery, and straight-up action spectacle, though at times it feels like it's at war with itself tonally. Directed by Ron Howard and written by Gregory Wyden, writer of Highlander, and scored by Hans Zimmer at his most chest-thumpingly triumphant, Backdraft tells the story of two firefighting brothers, Stephen and Brian McCaffrey, played by Kurt Russell and William Baldwin. Stephen, or Bull, played by Russell, is the seasoned, fearless fireman with a god complex. Brian, the younger brother, played by Baldwin, is trying to step out of his brother's shadow whilst dealing with the childhood trauma and chronic self-doubt. Russell channels peak early 90s alpha male energy. His performance is intense, charismatic, appropriately reckless. He plays Bull like a man on fire, all biceps, bravado and zero patience. Russell's sheer screen presence and pristine hairstyle carries the role. His chemistry with Baldwin is believable, rooted in tough brotherly love. Even when the character veers into unhinged macho territory, Russell grounds himself just enough to keep us invested. Baldwin, on the other hand, well, let's just say that it's a classic case of casting a Baldwin brother in a lead role when you're not casting Alec. William struggles with the material at times. His emotional beats often feel forced, and he lacks the gravitas to stand toe-to-toe with Russell or even De Niro. Still, he's not bad, just overshadowed. Baldwin is meant to be the audience surrogate, but he's too wooden to carry that emotional arc. Robert De Niro plays arson investigator Donald Shadow Rimgale, and in true De Niro fashion, he underplays it and steals every scene that he's in. His scenes feel like they belong to another film, more procedural and less explosive. Donald Sutherland plays the incarcerated arsonist Ronald Bartell and leans into the role like he's playing Hannibal Lecter's creepy uncle. He's fascinating to watch, but verges on full ham and mustard, nearly veering into parody, especially as he talks about fire like it's some spiritual force, with some absolutely schlocky dialogue. There's also the late, great J.T. Walsh, giving another classic J.T. Walsh performance as the smarmy, corrupt city official Alderman Swizak. He's great in this kind of role, always slick, always sweaty with ambition, always up to something, and of course, he's central to the conspiracy at the heart of the plot. In fact, his character is really the only reason that Jennifer Jason Leigh's character is in the film at all, to connect Baldwin's rookie fireman to the political machinations that Walsh is caught up in. That and the need for the obligatory 80s, 90s action movie sex scene. Baldwin and Leigh get hot and heavy on top of a fire engine right there in the middle of a firehouse. These kinds of shoehorn sex scenes have largely been phased out of mainstream cinema these days because they're outdated, unrealistic, and honestly kind of laughable. Unless, of course, it's two men. Then they seem to be 10 a penny and more than acceptable these days, especially in prestige Netflix dramas. But I digress. Leigh is utterly wasted in this movie. She's there to be a love interest, a narrative hinge, and little else. She tries to bring a dimension to her character, but it's really written as a plot device for Brian's emotional growth. Rebecca De Mornay, as Bull's ex-wife, has a few standout scenes with Russell, but the film isn't really interested in women unless they're crying, comforting, or walking away. The final character worth mentioning, I guess, is that of Scott Glenn as Adcox, the ageing firefighter who the McCaffrey brothers' father died trying to save in the opening scene, who raised those boys as he would his own, and who it doesn't take a genius to work out his connection to the mystery of the arsonist. After all, it has to be somebody already introduced in the plot, right? And the finale, my God, that finale. Backdraft builds to what I can only describe as a completely ridiculous chemical factory showdown. There's fire, explosions, running, fighting, slow motion leaps, collapsing staircases. At one point, Brian is spraying water directly onto what appears to be unstable chemicals, which I'm pretty sure you're not supposed to do. But realism left the building about 2 hours before that anyway. This is pure Hollywood disaster climax dialed up to 11. It's thrilling, yes, but it's also completely daft. Then there's that Life magazine photo. Throughout the film, Brian is haunted by this iconic photo taken of him as a child, holding his dead dad's singed and still smoking fire helmet, just moments after witnessing him blown sky high in front of his innocent eyes. We see the photo being snapped in another slow-motion scene by a street-level photographer standing right next to the kid. But when they show the photo, it's a literal still from the scene, a bird's-eye view from halfway up the building, a shot filmed by Howard during the actual scene. That kind of lazy continuity just bugs me. If you're going to make an iconic image part of your character's backstory, at least make it believable in the logic of the film. And let's talk predictability. If Ladder 49 was a bit on the nose with its narrative beats, Backdraft is practically shouting them through a bullhorn. And if some scenes in the Joaquin Phoenix movie were a little exaggerated for cinematic effect, then Backdraft takes it all the way up to 11 and beyond. Backdraft flirts with authenticity, but ultimately marries spectacle. The firefighting scene looks real, thanks to the use of practical effects and genuine fire rather than CGI. And the production team worked closely with actual firefighters. They used real equipment, but the procedure and the tactics of the fire crew, well, they're pretty dubious. Real-life firefighters have pointed out that charging into burning buildings without full gear or backup isn't brave, it's suicidal. And if you did survive, you'd probably be down the road before your next shout. The macho showboating might look cool on screen, but it's the exact opposite of best practice. And the way that the film treats fire as this living, breathing, almost sentient monster is pure Hollywood drama. Backdraft explosions are a real phenomena for sure, but they're incredibly rare and definitely not as theatrical as they are here. The movie turns fire into a mythic beast, which works cinematically, but it definitely edges into the magical realism territory. Backdraft is a bloated, brash movie which wears its macho heroics on its flame-resistant sleeve, but it's also incredibly well made. Hans Zimmer's score is big, brassy, deeply emotional. It feels like a 90s action score, but with more soul. The music lifts scenes that would otherwise feel hokey and injects genuine awe into the fire sequences. Mikhail Salomon's cinematography turns the fire into a character. Flames flicker like ghosts, shadows dance, and the action is often framed as a ballet of heat and destruction. The visual language is top tier. The practical effects, they steal the show. One of the best performances in the film, actually. And the fire, you have to remember, is real, not digital like the other two offerings. And you feel that heat. It's one of the last great pre-CGI disaster films. And Ron Howard, for all the film's faults, directs the hell out of this thing. It moves, it burns, it crashes, it feels big. But this film drips with sweaty, shirtless, masculine energy. From slow-motion shots of firefighters suiting up like action heroes to brotherly fistfights in burning buildings, it's a chest-thumping love letter to manhood, danger and courage. The women are on the sidelines, the men are crying over fire trucks and dying in each other's arms. There's a kernel of truth in the bravado. Firefighting is inherently dangerous and requires real guts, but Backdraft exaggerates the lifestyle into a near mythological realm where emotion equals yelling. Leadership means risking everyone's life, and heroism comes with a six-pack. Ultimately, Backdraft is very much of its time. A testosterone-fueled, melodramatic, overwrought blockbuster that probably wouldn't get made like this today. And yet, for all its faults, it's oddly compelling. A sweaty, shouty, sentimental ode to firemen as mythical heroes. It may not be subtle, but it certainly makes an impression. So there you have it, everyone. The very first episode of Film Threads done and dusted. Before we leave, there's a few things to wrap up. Of course, you want to know which of those three films is my film of the week, and it's got to be, for me, one that's realistic, gritty, with some great performances. It's well shot and doesn't verge on the ridiculous at all. So it had to be Only the Brave. A great film that if you haven't watched already, you need to get out there and check up. Also, you want to know the answers for the Take 5 movie quiz, don't you? So, film number 1 was the 1985 film with Emilio Estevez and Rob Lowe. It was St. Elmo's Fire. Movie number 2 was the Tony Scott movie with a CIA operative, Man on Fire. It's easy, wasn't it? Number 3 was the David Lynch prequel to a TV series. Of course, it was the prequel to Twin Peaks. The film Fire, Walk With Me. Number 4 might not be quite so obvious. It wasn't for me. It was a film I only found out about last year, and it's a fantastic, fun action film featuring the early Willem Dafoe. Streets of Fire. And finally, film number 5, the UFO abduction, which interestingly features Robert Patrick in exactly the same role that he played in Ladder 49, and that movie was Fire in the Sky. So there you go. Film Threads episode 1 done and dusted. I really hope you've enjoyed that. I would love to hear your own feedback, your thoughts, any suggestions you have about firefighting films that I might have missed, or if you want to give me some suggestions for other film threads that we could explore in future. Film Threads was a WN Movie Talk production, so if you want to get in touch with us, the email address is wnmovietalk@gmail.com. WN Movie Talk is also a podcast where we discuss films, so if you haven't found that already, please check that out on most podcast platforms. But I will be back with another Film Threads as soon as possible. So, until next time, thanks everyone for listening, and I will see you all again very soon. Cheers!